When my 8-year-old daughter Verity pulled those blood-stained dog tags from inside that rusted military motorcycle, I never imagined they would lead us to the most incredible family reunion of our lives. I'm a mechanic by trade, been working on engines since I could hold a wrench, but nothing prepared me for what we found hidden in that broken-down bike. Let me tell you about Verity first, because without her, this story never happens. She's 8 years old, barely tall enough to see over our workbench, but she's got hands that can fix anything with moving parts. I'm not exaggerating when I say she understood carburetors before she could tie her shoes. While other kids her age are playing video games, she's rebuilding transmissions and troubleshooting electrical systems like she was born to it. It's been just the two of us for 3 years now, ever since her mother died in that car accident. Those were dark days. Let me tell you, I didn't know how to be both dad and mom. Didn't know how to braid her hair or help with homework while keeping our little repair shop running. But Verity, she stepped up in ways that still amaze me. She became my partner in the garage, my business advisor, and somehow, without either of us realizing it, she became the one keeping me going when I wanted to give up. Her mechanical gift comes from my father, Thaddeus Morrison. Grandpa Thad, as Verity called him, was a Vietnam veteran who could make any engine purr like a kitten. He passed away when Verity was 5, but not before teaching her everything he knew about motorcycles, cars, and the art of bringing dead machines back to life. The day before he died, he told her something I'll never forget. He said, "Verity, sweetheart, remember this. Broken things aren't worthless. They're just waiting for someone who believes they can be whole again." We live in rural Tennessee, in a small house behind our garage where we take on whatever repair jobs we can find. Money's always been tight, especially since the accident, but we make it work. Verity has this incredible ability to spot valuable machinery that everyone else has written off as junk. She'll walk through an estate sale or auction and point to some rusted heap, telling me she can hear it humming even when it's been silent for decades. That quote exactly what happened the day that changed our lives forever. We were at a military surplus auction, hoping to find some tools we could afford, when Verity stopped dead in front of a pile of scrap metal. Buried underneath bent fenders and broken parts was what looked like the remains of an old military motorcycle. The auctioneer hadn't even bothered to clean it up or list it separately. It was just lot number 47, miscellaneous military, scrap. Everyone walked past it without a second glance. The metal was eaten through with rust, the tires were long gone, and most of the engine components were either missing or destroyed. But Verity put her small hand on what was left of the fuel tank and looked up at me with those serious green eyes of hers. She said, "Daddy, there's something special about this one. I can feel it humming even though it's broken." I should have known right then that our lives were about to change forever, because when Verity Morrison says she can hear a machine humming, that machine is about to tell us a story we never expected to hear. You have to understand our routine to appreciate why that motorcycle meant so much to us. Every Saturday morning, Verity and I would load up our old pickup truck and hit the estate sales, garage sales, and auctions within a 50-mile radius. We weren't browsing for fun. We were hunting for survival. Our little garage operation runs on a simple principle: find broken things that other people have given up on, fix them, and sell them for enough to keep the lights on. It sounds easier than it is. Most of the time, what looks like a diamond in the rough turns out to be just rough. But Verity has this gift that I still can't explain. She can walk through a sea of junk and point to the one machine that's worth saving. Take the lawnmower we found 3 weeks before the motorcycle. Everyone at that estate sale saw a rusty piece of metal with a seized engine. Verity saw a 1970s Craftsman with original parts that collectors pay premium money for. We bought it for $25, spent 2 days rebuilding the engine, and sold it for $400. That sale paid our electric bill and bought groceries for 2 weeks. But success stories like that were getting rarer. The competition at these sales was getting fiercer, and frankly, we were running out of easy finds. Our savings account, what little we had, was shrinking every month. I was taking on more repair jobs at the garage, working until midnight most nights, but it still wasn't enough. The stack of bills on my desk kept growing, and I was starting to panic about things like Verity's school clothes for the fall and whether we could afford to fix the leak in our roof before winter. Verity knew we were struggling, even though I tried to hide it from her. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for. She started suggesting we skip the ice cream truck when it came through our neighborhood. She stopped asking for new toys or games. Instead, she'd spend her afternoons in the garage, organizing tools and cleaning parts, making herself useful in every way an 8-year-old could. The morning of that military auction, I almost decided we should stay home. We had exactly $150 left in our checking account, and I knew Verity needed new shoes for school. But she'd been looking forward to this auction for weeks, circling items in the catalog she thought might be worth buying. She'd even made a list with her careful 8-year-old handwriting, possible good deals for Daddy and me. When we got to the auction house, the energy was different. This wasn't a typical estate sale crowd. There were serious collectors here, dealers with deep pockets and smartphones ready to look up values on the spot. I started to feel out of our league before we even walked through the door. The military surplus items were fascinating, but mostly out of our price range. There were restored Jeeps selling for thousands, vintage uniforms that collectors snapped up, and equipment I couldn't even identify. Verity was unusually quiet as we wandered through the lots, studying each item carefully. Then she stopped in front of lot 47. Honestly, I almost walked past it myself. It was listed simply as miscellaneous military scrap, and it looked like exactly that. There were bent metal pieces, broken headlights, fragments of what might have once been a sidecar, and buried underneath all of that was the skeleton of what the auctioneer later called a 1942 Harley-Davidson WLA, sold as is for parts only. The bike was in terrible shape. The frame was intact, but rust had eaten through the fuel tank in several places. The engine was seized solid, covered in decades of grime and neglect. Most of the electrical system was gone. The seat was long destroyed, and both tires were rotted away to nothing. But Verity knelt down and put her hand on the frame, closing her eyes like she always did when she was listening to a machine. After a moment, she looked up at me with absolute certainty. "Daddy, this one's special. I know it doesn't look like much, but there's something important inside. I can feel it wanting to tell us something." I looked at that pile of rust and metal, then at my daughter's determined face, then at our auction paddle number 247. $150 was all we had. $150 that should have gone to school supplies, to groceries, to the dozen other things we needed more than a broken motorcycle. But when the auctioneer got to lot 47 and the bidding started at $50, I raised our paddle anyway. Sometimes being a parent means trusting your child's instincts, even when those instincts don't make any logical sense. The reality of what we'd bought hit me the moment we got that motorcycle home. In the harsh fluorescent lights of our garage, every flaw was magnified. The rust damage was worse than I'd thought. The engine wasn't just seized, it was cracked in 3 places. The transmission housing had a hole you could put your fist through. Parts that should have been there were simply gone, probably sold off or scrapped decades ago. I spent that first evening making a list of everything we'd need to get this bike running again. The numbers were staggering, even buying used parts. From salvage yards, we were looking at least $2,000 in materials, not counting the hundreds of hours of labor. We had exactly $0 left after buying the bike. Verity seemed oblivious to my growing panic. While I was calculating impossible expenses, she was crawling around the motorcycle with a flashlight, tapping on different parts and listening carefully to the sounds they made. She'd developed this ritual with every machine we worked on, claiming she could hear what was wrong and what needed fixing. "The engine wants to run again, Daddy," she said, her voice muffled because she was lying on her back looking up at the undercarriage. "But there's something else, something that doesn't belong to the engine. It keeps rattling when I tap on the frame." I was too stressed to pay attention to her mysterious rattling. The next morning brought our first real crisis. Mr. Corwin, our landlord, showed up at 8 a.m. sharp with an eviction notice. We were 3 months behind on rent for both the garage and the little apartment above it. He'd been patient because he knew about my wife's accident, but his patience had run out. "I'm me." "Sorry, but I've got bills too," he said, not meeting my eyes. You've got 30 days to catch up on what you owe, or you'll need to find somewhere else to go. 3 months' rent was $1,800. We had nothing. I looked at that broken motorcycle sitting in our garage and felt like the biggest fool in Tennessee. We'd spent our last dollar on scrap metal while we were about to lose our home. The hits kept coming. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson called to cancel the engine rebuild job I'd been counting on. Her son had convinced her to take their boat to a dealership instead of trusting some small-time mechanic. There went another $800 I'd been planning to use for rent. Then Mrs. Hadley from Morrison Auto Parts called. She'd been extending us credit for months, but her distributor was demanding cash payments from all dealers. No more parts on credit, effective immediately. Without parts, I couldn't take on the repair jobs that kept us afloat. That evening, I sat at our kitchen table staring at a pile of bills I couldn't pay. Verity was in the garage again, still obsessing over that motorcycle. I could hear her talking to it like it was a person, telling it about her day at school, asking it questions about where it had been. When she came inside for dinner, her clothes were covered in rust and oil stains. I looked at her and something inside me snapped. Verity, we need to face reality here. That motorcycle isn't some magical treasure. It's a pile of junk that cost us money we couldn't afford to spend. While you're playing around out there, we're about to lose our home. Her face crumpled like I'd slapped her. She'd never heard me talk like that before. For a moment, she just stared at me with those big green eyes filling with tears. Then she straightened her shoulders in that way that reminded me so much of her mother. Grandpa Thaddeus always said, broken things just need someone to believe in them again. Maybe people are like that too, Daddy. She went to bed without saying another word, and I felt like the worst father in the world. But I also felt trapped. Every logical part of my brain said we needed to sell that motorcycle for whatever scrap value we could get, and focus on paying work that might actually save our home. The next morning, Verity was back in the garage before I even woke up. When I found her, she was sitting cross-legged next to the bike with her notebook, sketching diagrams and writing down measurements. I know you're mad about the money, Daddy, but I promise there's something important here. That rattling sound isn't coming from any broken part. It's coming from inside the frame, like something was hidden there on purpose. She looked up at me with such absolute conviction that I almost believed her. Almost. But conviction doesn't pay rent, and mysterious rattling sounds don't put food on the table. We had 29 days left to save our home, and I was starting to think that broken motorcycle might be the thing that finally broke us. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Corwin's eviction notice, then Verity's disappointed face when I'd snapped at her. At 3 a.m, I gave up trying and went downstairs to make coffee. Through the kitchen window, I could see a light on in the garage. Verity was out there in her pajamas and work boots, sitting next to that motorcycle with her notebook open. She had her grandfather's old stethoscope pressed against different parts of the frame, listening intently and writing down notes. The sight of her trying so hard to prove something I couldn't even understand broke my heart. I walked out to the garage, expecting to find a stubborn 8-year-old who needed to go back to bed. Instead, I found a determined investigator who had covered 3 pages with detailed diagrams and measurements. She'd marked specific spots on the frame where the rattling was loudest, calculated angles and distances, and even sketched cross-sections of the frame tubes. "Daddy, look at this," she said, pointing to her drawings. "The sound moves when I tap here, but it stops completely when I tap here. That means there's something loose inside this section of frame, but it's trapped between these 2 points." Her analysis was methodical and logical. This wasn't a child playing with a toy. This was a young mechanic presenting evidence to support her theory. For the first time since we'd bought the motorcycle, I actually listened to what she was trying to tell me. "Show me," I said, kneeling down next to her. She guided my hand to a spot behind the fuel tank mount where 2 frame tubes joined together. When I tapped on the metal, I heard it too, a distinct metallic rattling that didn't match any of the motorcycle's broken parts. It sounded like something was loose inside the hollow frame, something that had been sealed in there years ago. "You're right," I admitted. "There's definitely something in there. But even if we find out what it is, that doesn't solve our money problems." Verity looked at me with the kind of serious expression that made her seem older than her years. "Daddy, What if Grandpa Thaddeus was trying to tell us something? What if this motorcycle found us for a reason? I wanted to explain to her that motorcycles don't find people and that reasons don't pay rent. But standing in that garage at 3 in the morning, looking at her careful research and hearing that mysterious rattling, I found myself considering possibilities I'd been too stressed to think about before. "All right," I said. "One more day. Tomorrow's Sunday, so we won't miss any paying work. We'll take this bike completely apart and find out what's making that sound. But if there's nothing important in there, we sell whatever parts we can and focus on keeping our home." Verity's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? We're going to solve the mystery?" "We're going to try, but this is a partnership, which means we do this right. We'll document everything, take photos of each step, and work methodically. No guessing, no shortcuts." The next morning, we started with the fuel tank. It was more rusted than functional, but removing it gave us better access to the frame joints underneath. Verity insisted on taking pictures of everything before we disassembled it, saying we needed to remember how to put it back together. Working together, we removed the engine mounts, disconnected what was left of the electrical system, and carefully separated the frame components. Verity's small hands were perfect for reaching into tight spaces and feeling for loose objects inside the frame tubes. By noon, we'd narrowed down the source of the rattling to a specific section near the rear of the bike. The frame tube had been welded shut and painted over, but the weld looked different from the factory work. Someone had opened this section after the motorcycle was built and sealed something inside. "This is it, Daddy," Verity whispered, running her finger along the suspicious weld line. "Whatever's in here, someone wanted to keep it safe." I looked at my daughter's excited face, then at the mysterious weld that someone had hidden under decades of paint. 28 days left to save our home, and we were about to cut into a 70-year-old military motorcycle chasing the instincts of an 8-year-old girl. "Hand me the Dremel tool," I said. "Let's see what someone thought was worth hiding." The Dremel tool's high-pitched whine filled the garage as I carefully cut through the old weld. Verity held a flashlight steady, both of us holding our breath as decades-old paint and metal shavings fell away. The weld had been done by someone who knew what they were doing, but 70 years of vibration and rust had weakened it enough for us to break through. When the section finally came free, Verity immediately stuck her small hand into the opening. "There's something wrapped up in here, Daddy. It feels like cloth, but it's all oily and stiff." She pulled out a bundle about the size of a paperback book, wrapped in what looked like canvas that had been soaked in oil to protect it from moisture. My hands were shaking as I unwrapped it on our workbench. Inside the protective cloth were 2 sets of military dog tags, a folded letter that looked like it had never been opened, and a small black and white photograph. I picked up the first set of dog tags and felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Thaddeus Morrison was stamped into the metal, along with his service number and blood type. These were my father's dog tags from Vietnam. "Daddy, whose name is that?" Verity asked, looking at the second set. "James Whitmore," I read aloud. The name meant nothing to me, but the dates showed he died in 1968, a year before my father came home from the war. The photograph was small and creased, showing 2 young soldiers with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They were standing next to the same motorcycle we'd been working on, but it looked brand new, with fresh paint and shiny chrome. Written on the back in my father's handwriting were the words, "My brother Jimmy and me with our ticket home, 1968. My father had never mentioned anyone named Jimmy. In all the years I'd known him, he'd rarely talked about Vietnam at all. When I was growing up, I'd ask him questions about the war, but he'd just get quiet and change the subject. I always figured it was too painful to discuss. But this photograph showed a side of my father I'd never seen. He looked happy, relaxed, like he was having the time of his life with his best friend. The contrast between this smiling young soldier and the quiet, sometimes sad man who raised me was heartbreaking. Verity carefully unfolded the letter while I stared at the photograph. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the words were still clearly readable. It was dated March 15th, 1969, about 6 months after the date on James Whitmore's dog tags. It's addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Robert Whitmore. Verity said, reading slowly. Should I read it out loud? I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, she began. My name is Corporal Thaddeus Morrison, and I served with your son James in Vietnam. I know you must have received official notification about Jimmy's death, but I wanted you to know what kind of man your son was and how much he meant to everyone in our unit. The letter went on to describe James as a natural mechanic who kept all their vehicles running, a jokester who kept everyone's spirits up during the worst times, and most importantly, a hero who saved my father's life during an ambush just 3 days before he was killed. Jimmy threw himself on top of me when the mortars started falling. The letter continued. He took shrapnel meant for me, and with his last breath he made me promise to find his family after the war and tell them he loved them. I'm writing this letter on the ship home, but I don't know if I'll have the courage to send it. At the bottom of the page, my father had written, Jimmy's motorcycle was damaged in the same attack that killed him. I've hidden our dog tags in this letter inside the frame, hoping someday I'll be brave enough to restore the bike and deliver it to his family like I promised. If something happens to me before I can make this right, please forgive me, Jimmy. I sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what we'd discovered. My father had carried this guilt and this promise for 50 years. He'd never sent the letter, never contacted James's family, never restored the motorcycle. The burden of his friend's death and his unfulfilled promise had shaped the quiet, melancholy man I'd grown up with. Daddy, does this mean we can help Grandpa Thaddeus keep his promise? Verity asked softly. I looked at my daughter's hopeful face, then at the dog tags and letter that represented 50 years of my father's unfinished business. 27 days left to save our home, and we'd just inherited a mission that was decades overdue. Yes, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We're going to find James Whitmore's family. Finding James Whitmore's family took 3 days of detective work that would have made my father proud. We started with the return address on the letter, but the Whitmores no longer lived in Michigan. Phone calls to neighbors led to relatives. Relatives led to old friends, and old friends finally led us to Cordelia Whitmore Chen, James's younger sister, now 73 and living in Portland, Oregon. When I called her and explained who we were and what we'd found, there was silence on the other end of the line for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then I heard her crying. I've been waiting 56 years for this phone call, she said. Our family always wondered why Jimmy's friend Thaddeus never contacted us. The Army told us someone would bring Jimmy's personal effects home, but nobody ever came. Cordelia told us stories that filled in pieces of my father's life I'd never known. James had written home about his Tennessee brother, who was teaching him advanced motorcycle repair techniques. They'd planned to open a custom bike shop together after the war, combining James's natural mechanical instincts with my father's precision training. Jimmy wrote that Thaddeus was the most talented mechanic he'd ever met, but also the kindest person in their unit. He said Thad would stay up all night helping other soldiers write letters home because some of them couldn't read or write very well. 3 weeks later, Cordelia flew to Tennessee to meet us in person. She brought 2 suitcases full of James's letters home, and together we spent an entire evening reading through them. James had written about my father in almost every letter, describing their friendship, their shared dreams, and their promise to stay in touch after the war. But the biggest surprise came when Cordelia opened her laptop and showed us something that made my knees weak. She'd become a mechanical engineer after the war, inspired by her brother's letters about the amazing things he was learning from Thaddeus. She'd spent 30 years at Boeing working on military vehicle restoration projects, and when her husband died 2 years ago, he'd left her enough money to fund whatever project brought her the most joy. I want to help you restore Jimmy's motorcycle, she said. But more than that, I want to help you build the shop that Jimmy and your father never got to create together. The next 6 months changed our lives in ways I never could have imagined. Cordelia used her engineering expertise and her late husband's estate to transform our little garage into Morrison Whitmore Military Heritage Restoration. We kept the original space as our workshop, but added a showroom, a classroom, and proper equipment for restoring vintage military vehicles. The 1942 Harley-Davidson became our first official restoration, and working on it with Cordelia was like having my father there with us. She knew techniques James had learned from him, details about military modifications that weren't in any manual, even stories about specific parts and where they came from. Verity became our head tour guide, explaining to visiting school groups and veterans' families how patience and belief can bring broken things back to life. She still has that same instinct for finding treasures others overlook, but now she's also learned the value of the stories those treasures carry. We've restored 28 military vehicles in the past year, each one connecting us with families who thought their loved one's memory had been lost forever. Last month, a 90-year-old World War II veteran broke down crying when he saw his father's Jeep running again after 70 years. But the most important lesson came from understanding my own father better. I used to think he was distant because the war had made him sad. Now I realize he was carrying the weight of an unfulfilled promise to his best friend. He wasn't distant, he was heartbroken, and he never found a way to make things right. The restored motorcycle sits in our showroom now with both sets of dog tags displayed beside it. Every month on the anniversary of James's death, Verity places fresh flowers next to it, a tradition that will continue long after Cordelia and I are gone. Mr. Corwin never did evict us. When he heard our story, he offered to sell us the building instead of collecting rent. Cordelia helped with the down payment, saying it was what James would have wanted. Sometimes I watch Verity working on a new project, her small hands bringing life back to broken machines, and I think about promises that transcend generations. My father couldn't keep his promise to James, but somehow that promise found its way to us through a little girl who refused to give up on a rusty motorcycle that everyone else saw as junk. Broken things really do just need someone to believe in them again.